Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Ki-Joon Kim. I am a Principal Transport Specialist from Asian Development Bank. And on behalf of the Asian Australia Smart City Trust Fund team, I would like to thank everyone joining us today for an enlightening discussion on how cities can plan, design for mobility in the next 50 to 100 years. It's exciting. And navigate through volatile transition through smart mobility approaches. This webinar is organized with the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and ADB. And we have a very exciting and great speaker lineup this afternoon, so we do want to get started. So there are some household information. This session is sixth session of our ongoing Asian Australia Smart Cities webinar series. And with each session focusing on specific digital solution that aims to help cities to tackle specific issues related to the movement of the city planning systems, service delivery, and financial management. If you wish to receive invitations and updates about upcoming sessions, please to sign up your mailing list using the QR code or the link on the upper right of your screen. So there are several housekeeping announcements before you proceed, So the slides presentation will be of the session will be shared with everyone a day after the webinar, and along with the link to the webinar recording, which we will be uploading to your YouTube channel. And second, we will also be sending a link to your post-event survey, which we hope everyone would take time to fill out. Your feedback is greatly help us to understand you, our audience, as well as to improve our upcoming webinars. So Q&A, you have a Q&A session after our panel discussion. Q&A session will be open for questions from audiences. In the interest of time, we will not using the raise hands function of this Zoom platform, but we encourage everyone to submit your questions through Q&A box as we go along the webinar, which you will find once you click the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. When you submit your questions, please indicate which speaker you are directing your questions to before your actual questions. And we will try to accommodate as many questions as time will allow during our Q&A session. So we'll start with the opening remark, the Mr. Andrew Kolesnovsky. He is Australian High Commissioner to Malaysia. He is a senior officer with career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Trade, and the most recent ambassador for people smuggling and human trafficking. He previously served overseas as ambassador and deputy permanent representative to United Nations and New York at the Australian Embassy in Geneva and Pitt Villa and Pretoria. And he has served as chief of staff to UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as a senior Australian officer in the Coalition Prevention Authority, Baghdad, and as a World Bank representative in Iraq. So he's also a member of the Order of Australia. Welcome, welcome, Andrew. Can you provide your opening speech, please?
Thank you, Ki-Joon. I hope you can all hear me and see me. It's a great pleasure to be invited to provide some opening remarks for this sixth edition of the ASEAN Australia Smart Cities webinar series. I have enough material in front of me for about 20-25 minutes, but I've been told I only have 3 minutes. So I will try and limit myself to say just 3 things. The first thing is the debate about the future of cities has been going on for some time, before COVID. The question has been asked whether modern technology and work practices will render cities irrelevant and obsolete, with people being able to work in new innovative ways from home, etc. Since COVID, of course, that debate has sharpened. I have a view on that. I'm a bit with those such as the famous comedian Jerry Seinfeld, who say that it's not true, that cities do have a future in human development. I believe that the energy and the human interaction that only urban environments provide mean that the cultural gravity of cities will continue to draw people in. So cities are with us for the long term. That brings me to the second point, and that's really over to the people on this webinar. For cities to work and be sustainable, they have to be livable. And that means solutions have to be found for hitherto intractable problems such as transport around a complex urban environment. I know in Malaysia that is a current and live issue. It's KL, for example, where I live, is a city built around the motor vehicle. And I know that the issue of smart cities and mobility was featured in the last Malaysian development plan, the 11th plan, which ran from 2016 to 2020. We're yet to see whether smart cities makes it into the 12th Malaysia plan. We hope it does. But it's an issue which is important here. And I'm very pleased to see that thought is being given by the Smart Cities network to creating a new project for the urban area of historical Georgetown. It's one of my favorite places in the world, and I really hope that that project goes ahead. The last thing I want to say is something that was drawn to my attention literally minutes before I came on today, and that is that Austrade has been partnering with the Toyota Mobility Foundation around their City Architecture for Tomorrow Challenge, which is has the catchy name of Catch. And the good news is that 2 Australian companies have been shortlisted amongst only 6 in the world for that project. The 2 companies are Curb, which has a parking management platform, which is already available in Malaysia. And the other one is Liftargo, which is working with Sunway Group around a commuter transport pilot project. Each of those will receive $125,000 to develop their pilot projects for Malaysia, for Kuala Lumpur in particular. And one of those, I hope, will be the overall winner of the Catch competition to be announced in the middle of 2021. So congratulations to those companies. Congratulations to Toyota, to DBKL and MDEC, who are working on these projects. And of course, congratulations to all of those of you who have come in on this webinar. I really hope to hear later on about its success and about the innovative ideas that you're going to be able to take forward in the course of today. So again, thank you for the chance to say a few words. I hope I haven't gone too far over my 3 minutes, but I'm a fan of cities, so I want you to make them better. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think he has a very optimism about the future city and smart city. Also, he mentioned about Georgetown. I worked in Georgetown a couple of years ago for parking management and smart cities. I think Georgetown is a great opportunity to step forward to the smart cities. And next step is before we introduce our first speaker, we want to do quick temperature check on our participants' view on how digital technology are being used in your city. So this question is about how you perceive and assess your digital technology in transport sector in your city. The question is, how do you think digital solutions are being used to make transport more efficient and accessible in your city? That's the question we raise. And you have a choice, 5 choices: extremely well, or very well, and fairly well, not well at all. If there is something, but not well at all, or not applicable, which means that to your knowledge, no digital technology is being used for this purpose. So you have to make one of the choice out of 5 questions, and please vote on the one of the choice, and I will count 5, and after 5 the question will be closed, and you can click on the screen which to the answer you have, and I will count 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now we close. So, oh, yes, we have a result. Oh, that modern technology is so exciting. So we have most of the 38% majority voted not well at all. Yes, that's the reality. There is something, but you are not really perceive and utilize those things. And second is fairly well and very well, and extremely well is 8%, but none of the participant voted. About 5% is not applicable. So it means there is something you perceive something but not well performed in practice. I think it tells you what the government and the digital technology community should do for the people. And I will close this, and we will start. We have a scene setting presentation by Mr. Soren Hansen. He's the team leader of the ASEAN Australia Smart City Trust Fund we are working on, and he is he's an expert on master planning, urban development, transportation, and transport planning. Also, he works on the environmental assessment studies, and over the last 10 years, Mr. Hansen has been developing livable city strategies in urban development projects. He is an experienced project director with a demonstrated history of working in and across the civil engineering, industry, and principles. Mr. Soren Hansen, welcome to the webinar. Could you deliver your scene setting presentation, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ki-Joon, for the introduction. And let me just do a quick fly-in and scene setting for the discussion we'll have later. Yeah, next slide. Mobility has been a defining parameter for our cities from the day we started settling in urban settings. It has influenced the shape of the cities, the scales, the land use, the spatial distribution, livability, social interaction, and culture. And cities have been in an ever moving transition driven by mobility, starting out from the very early days from the walking city through the transit city to the auto city. And we have always been discussing what is next, how will cities be developed in the future, what will the future city look like. And take the next, please. And we always come up with pictures like this, where the future cities, well, they will be dominated by roads and a lot of traffic. We'll have high-speed mass transit elevated from the ground level. Might even have some drones, flying cars, or whatever. This is how we interpret the future cities. Next slide. And we have had this interpretation of the future cities for the last 100 years. It hasn't even changed a lot. This is an interpretation of the future of New York with flying not drones, but flying airplanes of a kind and elevated high-speed mass transit and so on and so forth. So we haven't actually changed our vision of the future city. Next slide. And we have actually built these kind of cities, and with the experience as we see here, with a lot of transport infrastructure taking up a huge amount of space, sorry, and only serving the needs of the system, the transport system, the cars. Next slide, please. And we have built our roads and transport system for cars, and in the anticipation that we want to bring the cars to the right to the city center, and it leads to congestion, loss of time in transportation, a lot of pollution, noise, infections, health issues, and so on and so forth. So this is the way we have developed our cities with the vision of building auto and car-oriented cities. Next slide, please. But what we are facing, as the High Commissioner said, we are facing a situation where we'll have a huge migration to the cities. We anticipate within 2050 to have more than 2/3 or maybe even up to 70% of the world's population living in cities. And if we just continue down the same alley as we have done until now, we'll clock all the cities, and we'll have a huge loss of time and production, and GDP will disintegrate in the big cities. So we need to move ahead with a new concept of urban planning and urban living. Next, please. And we have to move from the best practice planning within mobility and transport planning to the next practice. The best practice that we have been using until now has been retrospective. We have designed cities looking into the retrospective mirrors, using the old regulation, which might be defined 20 years ago. If we're looking at the transport sector, the road design has been set up 20 years ago, and we have been designing roads and transportation for following that best practice planning systems. But the cities we are developing will live for the next 100 years, and the infrastructure we are developing at the moment, transport infrastructure, will sit here for the next 100 years and will be a structuring factor for how cities are developing. So we need to look ahead when we're planning cities, and we cannot rely on just best practices, because best practice doesn't consider autonomous vehicles, it doesn't consider e-trade, e-commerce, health crisis as we experience today, social medias, migration, climate changes, and so on and so forth. So we need to move from best practice to the next practice, and the next practice is a human-centric approach. Until now, the best practice has been system-centric, where we try to optimize the transport system, the energy systems, and so on and so forth. But we need to look ahead and optimize the good living of the human individuals. Next, please. And there we can use a lot of tools. We can use sustainability, we can use smart solutions, we can use mobility solutions, and so on and so forth. But with the aim of not improving the individual systems, but improving the good life of the individual persons living in the cities and in the world eventually. Next slide, please. So we are at the brink of a fundamental mobility transition. I have listed here 4 driving factors for this transition. First of all, we have a total communication shift. The 5G allows us to introduce real Internet of Things, where the autonomous transportation really can boom and can be allowed through the high-speed communication that 5G allows. We are also in an economic transition. We are moving fast towards shared economy, and transportation is moving from individual ownership of transport means, individual ownership of cars, towards subscription to mobility services. So we are not owning our own mobility means, but we are just subscribing to services, and that's a huge transition for the transport sector and for the economic sector. The climate change is driving a change in transportation. We are moving towards electrical vehicles and smart vehicles who can see each other and act individually as autonomous vehicles. And we're moving as planners towards creating more mobility and at the same time less traffic. This seems to be inconsistent, but if we as planners plan our cities in the right way, we can actually improve mobility and create less traffic. And finally, we've seen that the Corona crisis has showed a profound vulnerability for our cities, and we have seen in this last year a transition in personal awareness. People are aware of how they can influence by their behavior, how they can influence the health situation in cities, and we have seen the consequences of crowding. So we are moving ahead now in a situation which might be a new normal, where we have to plan for crowding. We have to plan for personal awareness, and for more resilient cities. Next slide, please. I think this was the scene setting with the 4 individual main drivers, and I think it's now time to start the discussion.
Thank you, Soren. I think it was very short but very inspiring scene setting speech, I think. And he talked about 100 years practice we had with the motorization and highways. And also the key message is that he said we can have a more mobility with less traffic. That's the key message, how we achieve those things with the planning and technology and other measures. I think we have a good scene setting speech, and we will go into the discussion with the panelists. We have a excellent panelist listed, and I will introduce 4 panelists. And the first panelist is Kelly Nuttall. She's a national leader partner analytics and AI consulting in Deloitte in Australia, and her passion is working with organizations to turn data into insight and embedded AI and cognitive technology into business and government to deliver a better world. That's her passion, I think. And she's been working on developing understanding strategic business questions, issues, and at hand, and leveraging the analytic tools to tell a story and empower organizations to take action. And our second panelist is Mr. Ben Haig. He's a partnership principal in Via Transport, and he's been focusing on helping cities, transit agencies, and private operators, companies, and universities solving transport problems and improving customer outcomes. And also we have he was the, before VIA, Ben was the senior contract manager at the Transport for North South Wales, where he deployed and managed 22 on-demand pilots across the state, and established the permanent on-demand services in North South Wales. I think it's a remarkable achievement he made. And the next panelist is the Professor Farhan. He's a acting deputy vice chancellor of University Sains, Malaysia. And Professor Farhan is also he lectures in transport studies at the School of Civil Engineering, and also he's one of the pioneering member of commission. Member of the Land Transport Commission is SPAT. I worked with the SPAT before, and he's a member of the commissioner. Also, he's the Director General of the Malaysian Institute of Road Safety Research. And so that's the panelist we have today, and we will have a lively discussion with the panelist. And let's go into the questions to the panelists, and we have 5 questions to discuss. And the first question is where we are, and are there cities that are already ahead of the curve of smart city transition, and could look for inspiration in terms of how they have adapted some of this technology and infrastructure. So we will talk about, who has it and where we can see it. So can I direct this question first to Ben Haig? Can you elaborate to this question?
Sure. Thanks, Ki-Joon. A great question. I think it's interesting when I think of cities or areas that have emerging technology and applying them. There's a few places around the world. I think of places like Berlin. I think of Sydney, which is not too far from here. Los Angeles. I actually think of a place called Timaru in New Zealand, which is quite a small one. There's a reason for that. But sometimes I think about my own hometown. I'm lucky to live in a town here in Newcastle in Australia, and besides normal public transport, we've got e-bikes, we've got an on-demand bus service, we've had AVs being deployed here in trial, a range of different things that are being tested and tried. So there's locations around the world, but I think it's important, what I find, is to look at the attributes of these cities and places, of what's setting them apart and what makes them a smart city. And what I oftentimes find when I find these places, it's these cities and organizations that have a focus on sometimes a bit more of a longer term, and sometimes they have a more holistic way of viewing the world. So they have ideas of how can we use transport technology to help us achieve our environmental goals, whether that's reducing greenhouse gases, or it might be how can we provide more equitable and fair transport services to our old and our young? How can we connect them with employment or social services? Or how do we ensure that transport technology is allowing people with mobility issues to actually get it? So I look at these types of things, but it could also be with opportunities to allow commercial or private institutions to enter into that mobility market and provide more services and more opportunities. So I think it's important. And when I was listening to Soren before, he made a really salient point, which was we've got to be careful that we don't look to the past to direct our future. And I think these smart cities, and I'm sure that Kelly might have some things to say about this, we're using data to help inform the way we should build our future, but we don't actually want it to build just the same things we've seen in the past. So that data is really important to get us into the future. And I see cities using a lot of that in a really smart way. So, trying to find some common things as a transport ecosystem that fosters these new ways of doing things. And that's where I find these places around the world doing it. And they can be anywhere. Sometimes they're very large cities, but sometimes they're small ones. That little city I was talking about in Timaru in New Zealand, it's a small township really of only 30,000 people, but they've deployed new technologies to try and help their older generations to have access to social services and to be socially involved in what's going on in the community. And these are all different examples of how it can work, but I look for those different attributes.
Thanks, Ben. My apology. I missed one panelist, introducing one panelist. Sorry about it. That Miss Marianne Weinreich, and who is the expert in cycle policy and promotion, and she has advised the cities about sustainable mobility policy and promotion and mobility management. And she has been market manager in Rumble's Smart Mobility Division, where she lead through the leadership and the sustainable program. She is also co-founder and the chair of the Cycle Embassy of Denmark, and Denmark, who has the cycle genes, right? And the experienced speaker and the moderator for cycle and mobility conference around the world. Sorry, Marianne, I missed my screen scroll too quick. Okay, so we continue discussion about the. So Soren, you raised your ideas about this in the opening, the scene setting speeches. Can you answer to the question one, where you can see it by your experience? Where is the best cities you can introduce to see the transition?
Well, we have a couple of cities which are very interesting to look at. I would be so impolite to mention my own home city, which I'm sitting in now, Copenhagen, because Copenhagen might not be very advanced within the smart technologies. We don't have a lot of sensors and number crushers, cameras, and so on and so forth. But we have been very forward thinking within smart planning. And I would like to emphasize that it's very, very important to have a smart plan before you introduce technologies, because technologies are not smart in itself. You can set up a lot of technologies, but if you don't have a smart plan, the technologies might actually create I would say a stupid city where technology is defining the plan for the city and not the smart planning. In Copenhagen, we have been managed to the last 25 years redevelop the city into a cycling city, where 60% of the commuting in the city is done on bicycles, and now we have introduced smart technologies to support it, but the plan is that we change the city from a car-driven city to a bicycling city. Marianne can talk much more about that. I think also if we're looking at the technologies, Singapore is of course a very very good example of how to use technology to really drive a modern and a good mobility in the city.
Thank you. I think Soren gave the very important point. Plan smart first before you use the technology. I think that's the most important thing. I work in developing countries, and people have a kind of worshipping technology, that technology will solve the problem automatically, but it's not. So I think it's a good, very important message to the people. Plan smart, behave smart is the first thing to do. I think we have to move on to second question. So also, it's about COVID-19, and has the current global events such as COVID-19 pandemic affect the transition to this technology? How are cities coping with this? We see it, many cities reacting to COVID with the technology. And Professor Farhan, can you answer to this question based on your experience in Malaysia or as an academia?
Thank you. Thank you, Jun Kim. Thank you all for being here. Yes, I think the whole world is struggling with COVID, and we are only beginning to understand the actual effects. From my view, I think we are going to see changes in the way people behave, not only in mobility needs, but also in their life ecosystem. The way they work, the way they order food, the way they do shopping, this all has impact to overall mobility of people and goods. So I think if we were talking about smart city, we have to look into both sides of the dimension, the mobility of people and the mobility of goods. And if we don't strike the right balance, we will lose the equilibrium that we need to ensure seamless mobility for the city. But I think understanding here, this is where there are lacks or differences between leading countries and lagging countries. In countries like Malaysia and many other low and middle income countries, we are still struggling in cities to provide acceptable mobility. So without understanding our behavior, our demand behavior fully, we will not be able to do the smart planning. And I think we have to do that first. So any smart city options through the technology that we may be able to offer, we need to bridge this gap. And I think from my experience, data is very important. I think data requires a different look. You know, in Malaysia, for example, unfortunately, data are not widely shared, and I'm sure it's true in many other countries. So data are usually confined to projects, and I think that's quite dangerous because it doesn't give the full picture. So if I were to try to answer the question on COVID, our baseline is also not established. So it will be quite difficult for many cities, especially in the low and middle income countries, to establish the net effect of COVID. So somehow, my view is that we have to go back to basics, but technology can improve our speed so that we don't need to wait for too long, but we can actually hasten our catching up so that all the wonders of technology that they offer for smart mobility can also be shared and experienced by cities in the low and middle income countries. So maybe that first, Jun Kim. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. And he clearly said that data will help to understand, what's the impact of COVID on life ecosystem. And can I add one more question on to this second question, and to Marianne. And Denmark, Copenhagen has a bicycle system, and since the COVID, there are many cities converted. Personal mode has been increased. Do you think your previous existing bicycle system was kind of, you can think that it's a pandemic resilient transport system? How you, your government or your community judge of the bicycles system in Copenhagen in regards to the COVID response?
Yes, I would have to say and follow up on both Søren and Farhan, because, I think also this crisis has proven that smart and technologies are not in itself something that solves problems. Our basic needs as humans and in cities are walking and cycling. We need active transportation, and we need technologies then that can help and support us in walking, cycling, and using public transport. And with COVID, we've seen public transport being challenged because of lack of capacity. And cities around the world have in rapid speed turned to cycling by providing pop-up cycling infrastructure and measures supporting people in their choice of cycling with economical benefits, for having their bikes repaired, for buying bicycles. So bikes are now sold out in many cities. And we haven't seen the same thing happening in Denmark because we already had a resilient cycling infrastructure in place.
Right.
So we haven't seen in this to the same extent this very booming and rapid facilitation of cycling. And another thing is that when it comes to cycling, gender is of importance, because research showed that women are much more averse to risk than men. And that's why, except for instance in Denmark and the Netherlands, where we have a 50-50% men and women cycling, that's because of the safe infrastructure.
Right.
And there's huge potential in cities for actually facilitating much more cycling by providing safe, protected infrastructure that will actually also make women want to cycle. And it is in every mode. It's actually a challenge that we have a lot of data, but we are not collecting always gender segregated data. We are not analyzing data on looking at different genders and their needs, because there are many differences.
Sure.
And I also want to mention that here with COVID, we've seen that many of the so-called, essential workers that had to go to work, that could not stay at home, like I'm sitting at home now for almost a year, they had to go to work. And that's the nurses, that's the people working at the stores, that's the one that are cleaning. And a lot of them are women, because women do 75% of the unpaid care work in the world. So they have to get out there. So we need to create solutions that support them. And sometimes technology is not at all the solution, because maybe they don't even have access to using it. So basic infrastructure, walking and cycling, that's actually a very smart choice.
Thank you. I think it's Marianne gave some hope, which direction we should go to be pandemic resilient future of our cities. And for that question, and can we move on to the third question? Third question is, how can cities manage the transition to smart mobility technologies? What do cities need to keep in mind in planning for mobility using this technology for next 50 to 100 years? It's very futuristic question, but what they should keep that in mind in the planning. So can I ask that question to Ben first?
Sure, thanks, Ki-Joon. And I really enjoyed Marianne's comment towards the end. I'm a big advocate of walking and cycling, and I think that's a good segue in terms of when we're thinking about planning and bringing new technologies. Sometimes it's just allowing very basic technologies. You can't get much more basic than walking or cycling. And this is a guy that works for a tech company saying the same thing: is keep it simple where you can and make it easy for people and allow people to use the easiest form of movement possible, and things that will very quickly help with environmental, physical benefits as well. There's so many good things about that. But maybe just a couple of comments, because I think we want to hear from some of the other panelists. I think a couple of good things is, one is that cities, they need to be flexible. We need to actually try and realize that we are also trying to build, if we're trying to build for 50 to 100 years, what I oftentimes say is the one thing that we can guarantee is that we're going to get it wrong quite a lot of the time as we build for these futures. So we don't want to be super rigid in what we're doing. We need to have technologies that can actually evolve and change with us as human beings. We need to be the center of what we're trying to do. And so we need to be responsive to how we will adjust and change to it. COVID is a good example for that. I don't know what the next big world event that's going to happen, but it'll probably catch us a little bit by surprise. And we need systems and processes to be flexible and adjust to that. So I think that's really important. And coupled with that, at the same time, we can't use a fear of we're not sure what's going to happen to just stop and do nothing and wait for the future, because then we haven't built anything. We're just responding to it. So I believe that cities need to be bold. They need to be decisive in what they do, and they need to build futures that are human-centric, but also help us to achieve our different goals and realize that we need to have a sustainable planet where people have access to the services that they need, but it's also good from an environmental point of view. And so one of the things that I often talks about with cities or transit agencies is we can use technologies that can help to influence the way that we react and use transport networks. And so we need sometimes some tools that can help to push and influence us as individuals to make choices that make sense in total for entire networks. And I think we've built up some things right now that allow customers to have choice, but I think we also need to realize that there's some technologies coming out, and oftentimes I'll use autonomous vehicles as an example, that if we don't get that right, we could end up with cities where everyone's in their own autonomous vehicle. That's fantastic that your car drives itself, but have we just replicated the same problem with a new technology? And so we need to think about the way we ensure that aggregation and sharing of precious resources, whether that be land, air, space, time, used very efficiently, and that can be achieved through some technology. So those are some thoughts I have about what cities need to keep in mind as they plan for the future.
Thanks. And Ben brought more holistic approach by the cities needed. And Marianne, can you elaborate, answer to question? You answered a little bit about what do cities need to keep in mind in planning. You brought the gender issues and the gender favorable infrastructures, but in wider, not only for the COVID, a broad spectrum, what would you say about what cities should do?
Yeah, again, and I agree a lot with Ben, but also saying that cities should make sure that they have the basics down first, like walking and cycling, and a very good public transport system that could support the majority of people. That should be in place first. And then you can add elements and create a better and better experience for people using technology. But it should be something you build upon, that your basics is done. If you just add technologies, it really doesn't add anything unless it's for the very few that actually benefits. So I will say that, for instance, for technology is fantastic for improving our wayfinding and for ticketing systems, and in general, making a car independent lifestyle possible in cities. That is something that technology is fantastic for, and where we really benefit. Because I think it's important that also, as Ben mentioned, instead of going from a car-centric planning, we don't want to go to a technology-centric planning. We need to have human-centric planning, where technology is an enabler that support us having a sustainable city, a sustainable life, and make sustainable choices. So, because transport in itself, it's not something we do just for the fun of it. It's because it is the glue that holds our daily lives together. So it's kind of a kit, and we need to make that seamless and sustainable by providing us with different choices.
Thanks, Marianne. And I will ask the same question to Kelly. You heard two panelists talking about, technology is the tool. We have to have a basics ready. Basic things to do to utilize, maximize the benefit of technology. How you, Kelly, will respond? What would you recommend to the cities? What they should keep in mind?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I mean, I'm a massive technology advocate, right? It's what I do for a job. I think I agree. All technology should be user-centered design. It's there to solve a problem, not just a hammer looking for a nail. But what I think is important is the way that we're using these technologies. So if we take around the world of data, it used to be used for evidence-based planning and what would be the function of the network in a very static kind of way. So we would define that this motorway would serve this purpose, this public transport route would service this purpose, and it would function like that for the next 20 years. I think now we need to think about using these technologies and data in a much more, to still determine the function of the network, but in a much more dynamic way. So if we think about, some of the work I've been doing in the last 2 years has been, how do we create, we take all of the data we're collecting about cities and we turn them into a digital copy so that we can play out in real time. How do we optimize that network? So if we've got data around how a city is living and breathing at that time in a mobility system, we can essentially take that data, turn it into code, and optimize the performance of the network for a user outcome. And so suddenly, sorry, someone decided to call me. All right. Sorry about that. Someone decided to call me while I'm in the middle of talking. Yeah, but suddenly we're starting to talk about, that motorway serves that purpose, but maybe it's now at that time of day with a modal priority to this, and we'll send a pricing signal using technology to disincentivize different types of users on that network. So we can start to give that information to operators and indeed customers of the system to make much better decisions around how they use that information to make better choices. And technology in a way is the best travel demand management tool we have to give people that information.
Right.
People don't like to be stuck in congestion. So, and I think it's great. I'm a massive fan of walking and cycling and sustainable means of transport, but there's far too many cities in the world that is very much a very hard proposition to back. Like I come from regional cities in Australia where we have massive urban sprawl, really poor density that just can't justify the investment in mass transit solutions, and it's hot and it's not walkable or rideable, and they're going a long way now to start to think around how they actually build in cycling veloways and things like that. But at the end of the day, like, we've got a whole lot of urban sprawl because of poor land use and integrated transport, sort of planning decisions. We need to think around how we can use that technology, not just to jump to building more infrastructure, but how we can optimize the assets that we have already invested in.
Thanks. I think we have a time pressure here. So I'll move on to the next question. And achieving smart city, journey to smart city, what is the biggest challenge? What are the biggest challenge? Challenge can be different things in thinking or technology availability. And Kelly, can you elaborate more? When in practice, do you see any shortage of infrastructure, IT infrastructure, achieving smart city in your work?
Yeah, look, I think there's challenges in looking at infrastructure and technology in similar investment frameworks so that you can actually trade off. I think that's something we need to think increasingly more about. I think we need to also, when you're talking about these new technologies, we need to be thinking around consistency and adoption and the regulations that go around them. So something like autonomous vehicles, if you've got one, transport systems don't finish when you cross a country border or a city border. So like if you've got autonomous vehicles supported here and you drive over that network and they're not supported there, or they're not aligned in terms of the frameworks that support the use of those technologies, we're going to end up in a world of pain. So starting to think about these challenges and technologies at, I think, increasingly a global level is going to be important.
Okay, thanks. And I'll go back to Soren Hansen, who made the opening, the scene setting speech. Except technology, Soren, what do you think? What is the biggest challenge, obstacle to achieve smart cities? Can you elaborate shortly?
I think the big challenge is transition from our side as planners to move away from looking at systems to look at people. So we need to include many more parameters when we are assessing the needs of the city going forward. And I'm a transport planner myself, and when I'm planning a transport network for a city, I used to count cars, count bicycles, count pedestrians, and so on and so forth. But I never ask the labor market institutions, for example, and that's a big mistake because it's members of the labor market institutions. They are using the mobility systems and so on and so forth. So we are excluding quite a lot of information and quite a lot of data, which we need to build up a human-centric city and in a smart way. So I think we have a lot of technologies, both in analyzing data and in providing mobility. But I think we need a lot of data, creating the information we need to provide the human-centric solutions.
Right. Thanks. We are extremely in time pressure. I will move on to fifth question. And what can be done to support cities in the development and the deploy of these technologies? And are there particular partnership financing models that are worth exploring? And are there current initiatives that could help cities to accelerate the implementation and scale of the technologies? What support the cities can have? Can you we can have technology support. Can I ask to Kelly what support you can provide?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because these problems, which used to traditionally be the domain of engineers and planners, are increasingly also equally problems for technologists. And understanding what leading edge, cutting edge technologies can do is not necessarily where a lot of those traditional skill sets. So it's around how you bring those mindsets together to solve problems. And so if you can't, as a government, for example, write the requirements because you don't understand what the technology can do, but you can articulate the problem, what we're starting to see is a lot more sort of prototyping, sandboxing, innovations where, technologists can actually propose solutions to solve problems without these governments having to articulate hard requirements that they don't quite understand yet. So I think if we can come up with new interesting partnerships, collaboration through innovation without hard fixed scope, just to experiment and pilot, that helps us be much more informed at what we want to do moving forward. And we're seeing that a lot in Australia.
Okay, thanks. And Professor Farhan, do you think Georgetown can have that combined changing in thinking and introducing new technology in the near future using that different initiatives?
Yes, Penang State has always been very forward-looking, and I'm very, very happy to be in Penang. They have a different mindset and would like to explore. But of course, to sustain that will, the pressure, especially the political pressure, has to be addressed. I think this is where perhaps inclusivity comes in. A lot of time when we talk about smart city, it's about exclusivity. We need to bridge that gap between the good to have and the must-haves. And I think a lot of the community feel that they are being marginalized when we talk about smart city materials. But we are gaining grounds because, as given an example earlier, I think by Marianne, our information technology, the ways and the guiding of route and all that is now very common. It's inclusive. So I think the strategy for place like Georgetown and many other cities in the developing world is one to show that technology will improve mobility. Of course, that is not easy because it requires infrastructure, it requires a lot of strategies. But I think once the community sees that the authority is serious and the net results is inclusive, you get the buying in. And when the buy-in is there, I think the path is made easier, not only for the authorities, but for the financial modeling and for the support of the community. So definitely we need to move forward. And as I said, if technology can help the lagging countries to catch up in terms of the mobility needs, I think we will be able to, to be at par and top same and common problem one day sooner than later. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry about the time delay, but we move on to the question and answer session. We have a chat box and there is a questions. The first question is to Ben, and the question is about, there was a pilot project in North South Wales. What were the key lessons you learned in delivering pilot in North South Wales, and how would the cities in Asia learn from these lessons? It's question to Ben.
Sorry, Ki-Joon. Ben Haig had to leave for another meeting.
Sorry. Yeah.
But he already answered in the Q&A box to Greg Niles.
Yeah.
So please continue. Thank you.
So next question is from Azizov. It's a question to all panelists in terms of essential policy document. What policy setting document should cities should approve, i.e., for example, 2030's development strategy, mobility strategy, environmental strategy? Do you believe that budgetary decentralization in the country is an essential element for city development to take place? And Soren, can you answer that question? What kind of document it should be, to form the smart cities?
Well, it's difficult to say at this moment exactly which kind of document, but I think we need to change the way we are looking at forecasting of cities, because at the moment we have forecasts made transportation and mobility forecasts based on the behavior we have today. And just forecast along some lines and curves of development. I think we need to be much more looking at scenarios and scenario analysis and make the scenario analysis form the table we can play on, and then the documents have to be formed after a flexibility within this playing board. So they should not be so restrictive, but they should be much more flexible and allowing flexibility within planning, because we don't have the solutions for the future now, because we don't know the future, but we need to create flexibility.
Yeah, I will go for last question from the audience. The questions from the audiences. One of the questions is about Philippines, where I live, and what are the most important data that planner need to gather to make the best decision on active transport like walking and cycling? Marianne, can you answer that question? It's a difficult question.
It's a very difficult question, and there is no simple answer here at the end. But I think the important is to know the potentials and the limitations and the user needs in order to plan. But the backbone is always to have the safe infrastructure, the protected bike lanes. Otherwise, it's simply not, interesting or attractive for people to ride bicycles.
Okay, thank you. We will close the Q&A session because of the time pressure, and we will have a concluding remark by Mr. Tony Yao, and he is Tony Yao is the CEO of Digital Penang, which is a government agency of state of Penang, and established to accelerate the efforts to capture opportunities in the digital economy and promote digital engaged society. So he is the one who's leading the transition of the cities to smart cities.
Okay, thank you, Ki-Joon. I'll make it very brief, and thank you for all the valuable remarks from the various panelists. I think there are a few key points as a policymaker and implementer of some of the initiatives for smart city. I mean, it's very true that the basics needs to be addressed, and obviously the basics of biking and walking and all that. But fundamentally, I think there is the mindset of the people, I think, is very important, because it's about a cultural change, right?
Yeah.
I mean, mobility is about making sure that the human behavior is an evolutionary change, whereas the technology is a very disruptive, revolutionary change. And so trying to align these two is very important. So obviously coming back to this is definitely about understanding this and getting the data. And so we're trying to work on a project with Rumble and ASEAN Smart City Trust Fund as well, is basically how do we get a project to collect this data, and then also to not only just collect the data, but also to build a digital twin such that we can then simulate that and see how, when we introduce interventionist policies, how do people behave, and then how do we then modify and then implement the policies accordingly. I mean, some of these policies is also very related to, for example, the green policy, right? If you want to encourage going to going green and do EV, for example, introduction of EV vehicles, then how do you modify behavior and then shift that? So that was basically, I think, in a nutshell, I think some of the panelists did touch on, which is actually largely about the data and about human behavior and the experience that we deliver in that transition.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very brief, but Mr. Yao captured the essence of today's session. Is about mindset change, cultural change, evolutionary change. I think that's the key, and I hope you achieve something remarkable in Penang City.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. And we will. And at this point, I would like thanks to all the participants, High Commissioner and Mr. Golensky and Soren and Kelly, Marianne, Ben, Ahmed, and Mr. Yao. Thank you for participation and all the audiences who listened to us and who raised the questions. And I mentioned earlier, all participants will receive an email with a link to the post-webinar evaluation form and a copy of the presentation and the webinar recordings, so you can look at it. And our webinar series will continue with our next session in March 2nd, 1 month's time, which will discuss smart virtual reality to promote tourism sector recovery. I think it's very important session. Tourism is nearly most heavily damaged industry due to the COVID. If you would like to get invitations and updates about our upcoming sessions, please do sign up to your mailing list using the QR code or link on the upper right of the screen. And thank you very much. And this is the link. You can join us. And thank you, everyone. And on behalf of our speakers and organizing team, thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope you see you in March for the next seminar. Thank you very much.